A brighter future is underway in Portland's historic Western Cemetery. A revived group of volunteers, the Stewards of the Western Cemetery, are pledged to repair the gravestones fallen and sunken over the past century, to make this public green space more attractive and accessible, and to build an organization that will carry on into the future. I'm Peter Monroe, the Stewards clerk. I've lived in the West End since 1990. That's the cemetery's neighborhood. The first work since then in the cemetery that I'm aware of occurred in 1994. The facade of one of the 11 hillside tombs had fallen over and needed to be righted. The city did that work. But within just a few years, the stonework began pitching forward again. By 1999, the deterioration of the cemetery that had gone on for decades was joined by a new force, worsening the grounds. Growing crowds of unleashed canines were roaming the paths and family plots. The Friends of the Western Cemetery, the only volunteer group interested in the place, represented dog owners. In 1999, however, came the Irish of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. They came prepared to protest because they considered the loosing of dogs on their forebears' grave sites a desecration. Their protests gained a lot of publicity and political interest. Their protest was part of a larger project celebrating Irish contributions to the history of Maine. The Western Cemetery was a focus of that because its southern edge near Danforth Street is dedicated to Irish Catholics. So it was that in 1999, the bishop reconsecrated that area to those who had died during the Great Hunger in Ireland, the Angorta Mór in Gaelic, or who died later after coming to Portland fleeing it. Within 2 years, 2 significant public actions resulted from their advocacy for a change in the cemetery. First, the city sponsored a master plan, creating a map for the cemetery's future that still guides us today. Second, after considerable and contentious public debate, the City Council voted unanimously to ban dogs from the cemetery. Note the chain-link fence, which had surrounded the cemetery for decades. It contributed to the cemetery's use as a dog run and also to the sense that the grounds were not well taken care of. Within 2 more years, the city let a contract for more than $100,000 undertaking the repairs to the cemetery's structures and grounds that were needed. The work included restabilizing the hillside tomb facades. Somehow, the handsome young fellow in the red jacket won the job of supervising the project, working alongside city officials. At that time, the Davies Gate was crumbling and needed to be rebuilt. Masons from Nome Landscaping dismantled the walls, stone by stone, and reconstructed them, stone for stone, on new footings and a new core. The again handsome stone entry gate acquired a new universally acceptable sidewalk and curb cut. New granite was ordered for the pieces that had gone missing from the hillside tombs. With the help of stone specialists, I was able to determine the quarries from which the original granite pieces had come. The work involved both delicacy and heavy lifting. This bug light machine is a counterweighted forklift, capable of lifting heavy stones and placing them high or far. A young mason devised a way to secure the tomb facades without excavating or pouring concrete bases. He welded rebar together to connect the upright granite posts to the side slabs so the facades could never tip forward or fall over again. At least one vault had collapsed, crushing the wooden coffins inside and releasing at least one human skull, shown in the red circle. Tomb doorways were re-bricked as needed to keep the unhoused from turning the crypts into living quarters. Some of the tombs retain their iron or bronze doors behind the bricks. The location of missing doors is unknown. A photo from 1857, discovered at the Maine Historical Society, revealed the location of an obelisk on the hillside at the extreme left. The obelisk itself was discovered lying on its side in the cemetery below the slope. Masons poured a new base, and the obelisk was reestablished in its historic location on the hillside. Another part of the city contract involved my landscape architectural firm locating the historic locations of the cemetery's major paths, which had either grown over or become eroded. The amount of stone dust required to rebuild the eroded paths was in excess of 100 tons, requiring probably as heavy equipment as has ever been in the cemetery. The stone dust was spread with both bulldozers and hand rakes. Once the paths had been reconstructed, the edges were reloamed by hand and hydroseeded to grass. It was fascinating to watch all the people, machines, and processes involved in the effort. The next year proved to be eventful as well. A new volunteer group formed, a group devoted to a dogless cemetery and increased use of the public green space. The three co-founders were Andy Verzosa, myself, and Ann Pringle. Andy was then the owner of the Aucosisco Art Gallery in the Old Port. He's now the executive director of the Stanley Whitman House in Connecticut, where he also oversees an historic cemetery. He continues to be a helpful advisor to our work here. Ann Pringle, a former Portland mayor, kept the Stewards alive through the quiet years. In fact, I called her one weekend in the spring of 2022 and asked, "Do the Stewards still exist?" "Not really," she said. "What does that mean?" I asked. "Well, I'm sending off the paperwork to disband them tomorrow. They'd already be disbanded, but I'd sent in the wrong form." "Don't do that," I exclaimed. "We've got a group to take it over." And so the Stewards continue, and she continues as an advisor. Volunteer stewards cut back unwanted vegetation to promote enjoyable visits to the grounds and to discourage inappropriate uses like drinking alcohol on top of the combs. But a legal opinion from the city prevented anyone but family descendants from repairing gravestones. The city continued to work in the cemetery soon afterwards, clearing brush and leveling the corner of the cemetery nearest the Davis entry. Volunteer stewards also filled in and reseeded patches of erosion caused by the earlier packs of dogs. In the 2010s, the city changed its opinion and began allowing trained volunteers to work on gravestones. So Spirits Alive began quietly repairing gravestones in the historic Eastern Cemetery, but little besides decay was occurring in the Western Cemetery. The one exception had the stewards raising tens of thousands of dollars to replace the chain-link fence along Vaughn Street with a modern black steel picket fence. The chain-link fence was removed from the Western Prom side as well and left open. In 2021, a West End resident prompted the new beginning for the Western Cemetery that we are here talking about now. The instigator was this man, Sam Wilson, my neighbor, who said to me in that spring of 2021, "Because of COVID, I'm walking a lot in that cemetery, and it's a mess. We," his finger was pointing back and forth from himself to me, "ought to do something about it." Since he's a Naval Academy graduate, I just saluted. So Sam headed over to the Eastern Cemetery to train up with their veteran grave repairers. Here, Jane, Bill, and Dave are at work. Spirits Alive has been fixing Eastern Cemetery gravestones for 15 years. I headed north to Andover, Maine, where the professional conservator Joe Ferranini was spending 4 days for the Maine Old Cemetery Association, training people, including me, in gravestone repairs. Joe, out of Hoosick Falls, New York, demonstrated his specialized equipment for dealing with major monuments. This is his portable gantry. Each summer for the past decade, he has worked at cemeteries throughout Maine. The revived stewards became visible last year with some new leaders. John Funk, a just-retired lawyer who lives within a block of the cemetery, became the stewards president and acquired our federal 501c3 nonprofit status. Another neighbor, John Johnson, is drafting the cemetery's nomination to the National Register of Historic Places. As a public historian, John is a veteran writer of such nominations. The Maine State Historic Preservation Office has already determined that the cemetery is worthy of listing on the National Register. John and others are using existing historic records of the cemetery's burials to determine family backgrounds and their significance. Unfortunately, no records were kept of the many bodies that were disinterred in the 1850s when the city opened the more prestigious Evergreen Cemetery. In early May last year, we had assembled enough information for a tour. Publicity from the West End News and Greater Portland Landmarks brought out a crowd of more than 75 people. Similar tours continued irregularly into the fall. July brought Joe from New York State to Western Cemetery to assess which gravestones would be good to start repairing. They would be sturdily upright, above ground, and preferably highly visible. Walking around together, we chose this cluster of broken, buried, and toppled stones as a simple starter group. We expected to be able to complete this group of repairs and others within 3 days, but probing revealed more stones here than any of us realized. What at first appeared to be 5 stones turned out to be 9 stones, representing 7 persons. 2 infants had footstones, in 3 generations of a family named Green. Once cleaned and reconstructed, what started out as a bleak jumble of stone fragments became a prominent display of erect, restored, gleaming white marble tablets. Imagine a similar transformation occurring throughout the Western Cemetery. While the Green family stones were being restored, 24 volunteers learned how to clean nearby standing gravestones. Including in the stones cleaned, raised, repaired, and reset was that of John Neal, perhaps the most famous person buried in Western. Here, John Funk and I do the honor of unveiling the newly refurbished marble tablet. Another headstone, that of Ruth Stetson, has been made famous by our logo, a replica of its rose icon. So it also received special treatment. First, it got a cleaning from Sarah Groves, our gravestone cleaner-in-chief, who removed all its lichen and algae and washed it down. Then, she and Sam lifted it onto the new stainless steel pins and mortar bed on its raised and leveled base. Then they wrapped it all in a plastic jacket to allow the mortar to cure. Days later, Jill and I unveiled Ruth's resurrected stone, making the Stewards logo visible to all passers-by. Another issue requiring our attention is rampant vegetation threatening grave sites. It has escaped the city's mowers and presents another sign of the cemetery's dereliction. The city has to rely on machinery for almost all tasks in the cemetery, even leaf collection, despite the danger to historic elements, because it has only 5 cemetery employees. They have to deal with everything in 13 cemeteries totaling more than 400 acres. Last summer, the city arborist sent in a treaded tractor with a brush hog to clear all the vegetation from the Western Cemetery's hillside. The operation was stopped because Cemetery Superintendent Mike Samaga and we stewards prefer a selective cutting to preserve native tree saplings. This is the tool that can make selective removals possible. It's called a weed wrench. We bought one with the words Western Cemetery welded onto its side. Pulling on the long handle causes the jagged jaws to clamp onto the stump of a multiflora rose or the unwanted trunk of a sapling. Then stepping onto the foot and yanking on the handle applies great force and causes the sapling to pop out of the ground. Managing the grounds provides the one major activity where our future actions will depart from the 2001 master plan. Take trees, for example. They are currently scattered across the cemetery, creating the park-like atmosphere we all so enjoy, especially during the increasingly hot summers. This pattern will be retained. By contrast, the master plan's author, Vic Walker, out of Boston, recommended that most existing trees be removed and replaced by a double allée around the central woodbine grove, as shown here. Not only did no such arrangement ever exist except on paper, but such a misguided action would violate terms of the Vaughan sale of the land to the city, which required retaining red pine trees. But it would also cause howls of popular protest. As to ground covers, Heather McCargo, the founder of the Wild Seed Project, led a native plant tour on a rainy June day last year. She described the many wildflowers to be found on these 12 acres, despite mowing and raking regimes that tend to discourage them. A blanket of pussy toes reflects the dry, sandy soils that predominate in the cemetery. The soils make digging graves easy and growing grass hard. Native evening primrose is also drought tolerant and loves the open areas of full sun in the cemetery. A vegetation management plan is being drafted and reviewed for city approval that will promote wildflowers and more tree canopy in the cemetery. This year and beyond, don't we have plans? Even though it's the still of winter, we are pushing forward on them. We are buying and stockpiling in my basement tools needed for gravestone cleaning and repairs. Until now, we've depended on Joe Farinini's tools. We're storing some tools and mortar in a toolbox we bought and installed just inside the maintenance entry of the cemetery, but more storage space is needed. We still have to ferry tools and water to and from neighbors' houses, time-consuming and inefficient. We looked at the 1857 photo again and noticed the small building near Vaughan Street. Parks Commission reports from the 1800s referred to it as the tool house. A map from the 1800s showed the building being located near where we have placed our toolbox. The historic tool house in Western Cemetery was roughly the same size as the present-day tool house in the Eastern Cemetery, known as the Dead House because there's a tomb entry inside it. But it is large enough to store all the wheelbarrows, tripods, sprayers, and bags of mortar Spirits Alive needs to make their stone repairs. So architect Carol DeTine of Carriage House Studio in the West End drafted plans for a tool house similar to the one in the Eastern Cemetery. We made a computer mock-up of the proposed design in its proposed location for review by the city's Historic Preservation Board. By the way, it won't have these colors, which were applied for visibility. The actual colors will be variations of the earth tone grays and browns found in the stones at the Davis entry. We hired a historic archaeologist, Barry Rodrigue, from Bristol, Vermont, who stated that there was no evidence of bodies ever having been buried where we planned to put the tool house. We met with the historic board in January of this year, and they approved the tool house design and location with one condition. Despite Barry's report, we must use a ground-penetrating radar machine to confirm the lack of relics or remains at the site. We have located such a machine, which looks like a lawnmower, and are learning how to use it for this purpose. We will also use the radar machine along the water line alignment between a stub at the entry fence and the tool house. A small box in the ground near the tool house will contain a hose bib, allowing us to refill water buckets for mortar and sprayers for cleaning stones on site. The tool house and water line form a major part of a fund drive we have underway to raise $250,000. Part of those monies will go toward extending the black picket fence the length of the western promenade side of the cemetery. And some more money will go toward restoring sections of historic wrought iron fence at the upper corner of the cemetery. Elsewhere, we will be asking the city to provide gravel for a temporary sidewalk along the western prom. The city has plans to build a brick sidewalk there within 5 years, but the eroded conditions along the path militate for a safer surface more immediately. Curb cuts along the western promenade road, to be carried out by the Department of Public Works, will allow access from the cemetery to the 2 Portland trails down the western prom slope, the Toboggan Run and the Carriage Road Trail. The city has also agreed to address visitors' pressing need for ways to linger in the cemetery. Some have already taken the initiative to furnish hammocks or seats in the grounds themselves. But the city has pledged to find contributions soon to place a half-dozen historic-style benches in the cemetery in locations that we recommend. Perhaps you'd like to honor a friend who has loved the cemetery. She could have her name on a World Fair-style bench. So although it may appear to be a quiet season when little is going on in the Western Cemetery, To the contrary, be assured we stewards and the city are hard at work in multiple ways planning a better future for the Western Cemetery, for all its permanent residents and all its transient visitors too. So contact us at this address, stewardswesterncemetery@gmail.com, to volunteer, contribute to our capital campaign, or just to say hello. You can contribute online at PayPal using this address. We'd love to hear from you. We are sure you could help us, if you wish, to bring a new day to our beloved Western Cemetery. Thank you so very much.